Millionaire humiliated the mechanic at the shop until he started the car and silenced everyone. Welcome back to our channel. Today you're about to witness one of the most incredible stories of justice and redemption we've ever shared. This is the story of a millionaire who humiliated a mechanic at the shop until he started the car and silenced everyone. If you're ready to see how pride can be completely shattered in seconds, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and activate notifications so you never miss our amazing stories. Now, let's dive into this unforgettable tale. The autumn wind whistled through the streets of downtown Portland, carrying with it the crisp scent of fallen leaves and the promise of rain. Marcus Thompson adjusted his worn work jacket as he stepped out of his modest apartment, the same routine he'd followed for the past 15 years. At 42, his hands bore the permanent stains of motor oil and hard work, but his eyes still held the spark of someone who genuinely loved what he did for a living. Thompson's Auto Repair sat on the corner of Oak and 3rd Street, a humble establishment that had been serving the community since Marcus took over from his mentor, old Joe Sullivan. The building wasn't much to look at from the outside. Weathered brick walls, a simple sign that had seen better days, and a small parking lot that could fit maybe 8 cars comfortably. But inside those walls, magic happened daily as Marcus breathed life back into engines that others had written off as hopeless cases. The morning started like any other Tuesday in October. Marcus unlocked the heavy metal doors, flipped on the fluorescent lights that hummed to life overhead, and surveyed his domain. The shop smelled of motor oil, metal, and the coffee he'd brewed in the small break room tucked behind his office. 3 vehicles waited for his attention. Mrs. Patterson's old Honda Civic that needed a transmission check, a pickup truck with brake issues, and a motorcycle that had been giving its owner trouble starting. At exactly 9:30, the rumble of a powerful engine announced an arrival that would change everything. Through the large bay windows, Marcus watched as a pristine Lamborghini Huracan in pearl white pulled into the parking lot. The car gleamed under the morning sun like a piece of jewelry, every curve and line speaking of Italian engineering perfection and a price tag that could feed a family for years. The driver's door opened with a soft click, and out stepped Richard Hawthorne III, heir to the Hawthorne real estate empire, and a man who wore his wealth like armor. Everything about him screamed money, from his perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in 2 months, to his Italian leather shoes that had never seen a day of real work. His blonde hair was styled with precision, and his blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had never been told no in his 35 years of privileged existence. Hawthorne looked around the modest shop with barely concealed disgust, his nose wrinkling as if the very air offended him. He pulled out his phone, the latest model that had been released just weeks ago, and checked something before sliding it back into his jacket pocket. With deliberate slowness, he approached the entrance, his expensive shoes clicking against the concrete with each step. Marcus had dealt with all types of customers over the years. He'd learned to read people quickly, and something about this man's demeanor immediately put him on edge. Still, a customer was a customer, and Marcus believed in treating everyone with respect, regardless of their background or bank account. "Good morning," Marcus called out, wiping his hands on a shop rag as Hawthorne entered. "How can I help you today?" Hawthorne didn't immediately respond. Instead, he continued his visual inspection of the shop, his gaze lingering on the older equipment, the oil stains on the concrete floor, and the modest waiting area with its mismatched chairs and coffee table covered in automotive magazines. When his eyes finally settled on Marcus, there was something cold and calculating in his expression. "I suppose you're the owner of this establishment?" Hawthorne's voice carried the crisp accent of private education and social clubs that regular people could never afford to join. "That's right, Marcus Thompson." He extended his hand in greeting, but Hawthorne made no move to take it. After an awkward moment, Marcus lowered his hand, maintaining his professional composure despite the obvious slight. "Mister, Thompson, Hawthorne began, pulling out a business card and placing it on the counter without getting too close. I am Richard Hawthorne III. Perhaps you've heard of Hawthorne Properties. We own half the commercial real estate in this city. Marcus nodded politely, though the name-dropping seemed unnecessary and pompous. What brings you to my shop today, Mr. Hawthorne? Hawthorne gestured vaguely toward his Lamborghini with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to having his problems solved by others. My car has been making an unusual noise. Nothing serious, I'm sure. It's a precision machine worth more than this entire building and everything in it. I just need someone to listen to it and confirm what I already know. The condescension in his tone was impossible to miss, and Marcus felt his jaw tighten slightly. He'd encountered wealthy customers before, but few had been so openly dismissive and insulting from the moment they walked through his door. Still, he maintained his professional demeanor, reminding himself that good service spoke louder than any argument. I'd be happy to take a look and listen to what's going on, Marcus replied evenly. Why don't you tell me more about this noise you're hearing? It's a slight irregularity in the engine note when I accelerate above 60 miles per hour. Probably just needs a minor adjustment, something even a local mechanic should be able to handle without too much difficulty. Marcus bristled at the implied insult, but kept his voice level and professional. Let's take a listen then. Would you mind starting the car for me so I can hear what you're describing? As they walked toward the Lamborghini, Marcus couldn't help but appreciate the engineering marvel before him. The Huracan was indeed a beautiful machine, representing the pinnacle of automotive design and performance. He'd worked on luxury vehicles before, though never one quite this expensive or exclusive. His passion for cars extended far beyond the modest vehicles he typically serviced, and he'd spent countless hours studying the intricacies of high-performance engines from manufacturers around the world. Hawthorne climbed into the driver's seat with obvious reluctance, as if the mere act of demonstrating the problem to a common mechanic was beneath his dignity. He started the engine, and the V10 roared to life with a sound that was pure automotive poetry. Even at idle, the car commanded respect and attention from anyone within hearing distance. "Now," Hawthorne called out through the open window with barely concealed impatience, "listen carefully when I rev the engine. Try to focus." Marcus positioned himself near the rear of the vehicle. His experienced ear immediately focused on the engine's symphony. As Hawthorne increased the RPMs, Marcus heard it, a subtle but distinct irregularity in the exhaust note, like a missed beat in a perfectly tuned orchestra. His trained ear immediately began analyzing the possible causes, timing issues, fuel delivery problems, or perhaps something in the exhaust system itself. But as he listened more carefully, something else caught his attention. Beneath the obvious problem Hawthorne had described, there was another sound, something far more serious that the wealthy man had either missed entirely or chosen to ignore. It was a subtle metallic tapping that spoke of potential engine damage, the kind of issue that could turn catastrophic if left unaddressed. Marcus raised his hand, signaling for Hawthorne to shut off the engine. The Lamborghini fell silent, and the sudden quiet seemed to amplify the tension that had been building since the moment the wealthy man had arrived at his shop. "Well?" Hawthorne demanded, climbing out of the car with obvious impatience and annoyance. "As I suspected, it's just a minor issue, correct? Something you can fix quickly so I can be on my way and not waste any more of my valuable time?" Marcus chose his words carefully, knowing that what he was about to say would not be well received. "There is indeed an irregularity in the engine note, but I'm afraid it might be more serious than you think. I'd need to perform a more thorough diagnostic to determine the exact cause and scope of the problem." Hawthorne's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering before a tempest. "More serious? This is a Lamborghini, Mr. Thompson, not some rusty pickup truck or economy car. It's a precision instrument built by master craftsmen in Italy, using the finest materials and most advanced technology available. I seriously doubt that someone working in a shop like this would understand the complexities of such sophisticated engineering. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a backfiring engine. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to remain professional despite the growing urge to tell this arrogant customer exactly what he thought of his attitude and assumptions. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Hawthorne, but unusual sounds in any engine, regardless of its pedigree or price tag, deserve proper investigation. If you'd like, I could connect the car to my diagnostic equipment and run some tests to get a clearer picture of what's happening." "Diagnostic equipment?" Hawthorne laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor or warmth. "What kind of diagnostic equipment could you possibly have in a place like this that would be sophisticated enough for a car worth $300,000? Do you have any idea what you're dealing with here?" As if fate had decided to prove a point, the sound of another engine filled the parking lot. Both men turned to see Jake Morrison pulling up in his modified 1969 Dodge Charger, the muscle car's V8 rumbling with a deep, satisfying growl that announced its presence to the entire neighborhood. Jake had been Marcus's friend since high school, and despite now working as a successful software engineer for one of Portland's tech companies, he still brought his classic car to Marcus for maintenance and modifications. Jake parked next to the Lamborghini, and the contrast between the two vehicles was striking. Old American muscle versus modern Italian precision, each beautiful in its own way, but representing completely different philosophies of automotive design and engineering. As Jake got out of his car, he immediately noticed the tension in the air and the way Marcus was standing with his arms crossed, a sure sign that his friend was dealing with a difficult customer. "Morning, Marcus," Jake called out cheerfully, then nodded politely to Hawthorne. "Beautiful Lambo, having some work done?" Before Marcus could respond, Hawthorne stepped forward with his chest puffed out like a rooster defending his territory. "I'm trying to get a simple diagnosis, but I'm beginning to think I've come to the wrong place entirely. This gentleman seems to think his local expertise is sufficient for a vehicle of this caliber and sophistication." Jake's eyes narrowed slightly as he picked up on the condescension in Hawthorne's voice. He'd known Marcus long enough to recognize the signs of someone being disrespected, and his friend's tense posture spoke volumes about what had been happening before his arrival. "Well, you're in good hands here," Jake said firmly, his voice carrying a note of warning. "Marcus knows more about engines than anyone I've ever met. He's diagnosed problems that dealerships missed and fixed things that other mechanics said were impossible to repair. I'm sure he's perfectly adequate for ordinary vehicles," Hawthorne replied dismissively, waving his hand as if shooing away an annoying insect. "But this requires someone with specialized training in European luxury automobiles and high-performance engine systems." Marcus finally reached his limit. The constant insults and condescension had worn through his professional patience like sandpaper on steel, and something in his voice shifted from polite service to quiet authority. "Mr. Hawthorne, I've been working on cars for over 20 years. I've diagnosed and repaired everything from economy cars to exotic sports cars, and I've never met an engine I couldn't understand. If you don't trust my expertise, you're certainly welcome to take your vehicle elsewhere." Hawthorne's eyes flashed with anger and indignation. "Perhaps I should do exactly that. Clearly this was a mistake from the beginning. I should have known better than to expect competent service in a place like this, dealing with people who don't understand what real quality looks like." The wealthy man turned toward his car, as if to leave, but something made him pause. Maybe it was the way Jake was looking at him, with obvious disapproval, or the quiet dignity with which Marcus had handled his abuse. But Hawthorne seemed to decide that simply leaving wouldn't be satisfying enough. He needed to make his point more forcefully, to put these people in what he considered their proper place. "You know what bothers me most about people like you?" Hawthorne said, turning back to face Marcus with renewed venom. You think that because you can change oil and replace brake pads, you understand precision engineering. This car represents decades of Italian automotive excellence, crafted by engineers with advanced degrees from the finest universities in Europe, and decades of experience working with the most sophisticated materials and technologies available. What makes you think that your blue-collar education could possibly compare to that level of expertise? The parking lot fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic on Oak Street and the rustle of autumn leaves in the wind. Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands clenched at his sides, while Jake took a step forward, his own anger beginning to show on his face. "That's enough," Jake said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who wouldn't tolerate any more abuse of his friend. "You don't know what you're talking about, and you're way out of line." Hawthorne laughed again, the sound even more grating than before. "Oh, let me guess. Another local defending his friend? How quaint and predictable. Tell me, do either of you even know what kind of engine is in this car? Do you understand the complexity of its electronic systems, its advanced traction control, its sophisticated fuel injection mapping?" Marcus looked at the Lamborghini for a long moment, then back at Hawthorne. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but filled with an authority that hadn't been there before, like a master craftsman finally ready to demonstrate his true skills. "It's a 5. 2-liter naturally aspirated V10 engine, based on the power plant originally developed for the Gallardo, but significantly updated and refined for the Huracan platform. It produces 602 horsepower at 8,250 RPM and 413 pound-feet of torque at 6,500 RPM. The fuel injection system uses both direct and port injection for optimal performance and emissions, and the all-wheel drive system can send up to 100% of the power to the rear wheels, depending on driving conditions and the selected driving mode. Hawthorne's confident smirk faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly, unwilling to admit that he might have underestimated the man standing before him. "Anyone can memorize specifications from a magazine or website," he said dismissively. "That doesn't mean you actually understand how these systems work together or how to diagnose problems when they arise." Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. "The engine management system uses a Bosch Motronic ECU with adaptive learning capabilities that constantly adjust fuel delivery and ignition timing based on driving conditions. The exhaust system features active sound management through electronically controlled valves that open and close to optimize both performance and acoustics. The transmission is a 7-speed dual-clutch unit with launch control and multiple driving modes that adjust everything from throttle response to suspension stiffness." Now Hawthorne was definitely unsettled, his face showing the first signs of doubt about his assumptions, but his pride wouldn't let him back down or admit that he might have been wrong about this humble mechanic. "Impressive Googling," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "But knowing facts doesn't mean you can actually work on it or understand what's really wrong when problems develop." "You're absolutely right," Marcus said calmly, his demeanor shifting to that of a professor about to deliver a crucial lesson. "But 23 years of hands-on experience does mean something, including the 2 years I spent training at the Lamborghini factory in Sant'Agata Bolognese before I came back to the States to take over this shop." The silence that followed was deafening. Hawthorne's face had gone completely pale, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he seemed to be genuinely at a loss for words. Jake was grinning openly now, thoroughly enjoying watching the arrogant millionaire realize that he'd made a serious miscalculation about the man he'd been insulting. But Marcus wasn't finished revealing the depth of Hawthorne's ignorance and assumptions. "The sound you're hearing isn't just a minor irregularity, Mr. Hawthorne. Based on what I heard during that brief test, you actually have 2 separate issues. The first is likely a timing problem with your variable valve timing system. Annoying, but not immediately dangerous. The second is much more serious and potentially catastrophic. You have what sounds like bearing knock in your number 7 cylinder, which means you're looking at potential engine damage that could cost you tens of thousands of dollars if you continue driving the car hard. Hawthorne's face had gone from pale to red as the implications of what he was hearing began to sink in. That's impossible. This car has only 15,000 miles on it. It's been perfectly maintained by authorized dealers using only genuine parts and factory-approved procedures. Sometimes these things happen even with low-mileage vehicles, Marcus replied with the patience of someone who'd explained similar situations countless times over the years. Especially if the car has been driven aggressively without proper warm-up periods, or if there was a manufacturing defect that's just now beginning to manifest itself. For a moment, it seemed like Hawthorne might actually listen to reason and accept the expertise that was being offered to him. But then his pride and arrogance reasserted themselves like a rising tide, and his expression hardened again into its familiar mask of superiority and disdain. "I don't believe you," he said flatly. "You're just trying to justify expensive repairs on a perfectly good car that probably doesn't need anything more than a minor adjustment. This is exactly the kind of scam I'd expect from a place like this. Trying to take advantage of someone who drives an expensive car." Jake stepped forward again, his patience finally exhausted after watching his friend endure nearly an hour of insults and condescension. "You need to apologize to my friend right now. He's trying to help you, and you're being completely unreasonable and insulting." "Apologize?" Hawthorne's voice rose in indignation. "To him? For what? For refusing to be taken advantage of by some local mechanic who thinks he's qualified to work on a car that's worth more than his annual salary?" The tension in the parking lot was now thick enough to cut with a knife. Other customers had begun to notice the commotion, and a small crowd was starting to gather at the edge of the property to see what all the shouting was about. Marcus could feel his reputation, everything he'd built over 15 years of honest work and dedication to his craft, being questioned and undermined by this arrogant stranger who knew nothing about him or his capabilities. But what happened next would change everything and turn the tables in a way that no one could have anticipated. As Marcus stood there, absorbing yet another insult and trying to maintain his composure, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and saw a number he recognized immediately, one that would prove to everyone present that Richard Hawthorne III had made the biggest mistake of his entitled life. The call was from Antonio Benedetti, chief engineer at Lamborghini's North American division and Marcus's former colleague from his time working in Italy. Antonio only called when he needed Marcus's expertise on the most challenging problems that even the factory technicians couldn't solve. Marcus looked at Hawthorne one more time, then at Jake, who was still bristling with anger on his friend's behalf. The small crowd of onlookers waited to see what would happen next. Would the humble mechanic back down in the face of such wealth and arrogance, or would the truth finally have its moment to shine? "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly, answering the call while maintaining eye contact with Hawthorne. "Antonio, good morning." "Marcus, my friend." The Italian accent was warm and familiar through the phone speaker, loud enough that both Hawthorne and Jake could hear every word clearly. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time, but we have a situation here at the technical center that requires your expertise." Hawthorne's eyebrows shot up at the foreign accent and the obvious familiarity in the caller's voice. Jake, meanwhile, was beginning to smile as he realized what was happening and how the morning was about to take a dramatic turn. "Never a bad time for you, Antonio." "What's going on?" Marcus kept his voice professional, but there was a warmth there that hadn't been present during his conversation with Hawthorne. "We have a hurricane here at the factory that's exhibiting some very unusual symptoms," Antonio continued, his voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "The owner brought it in after experiencing intermittent power loss, but our diagnostic equipment isn't showing anything definitive. The engine sounds perfect at idle, but there's something not right when we push it hard. We think it might be related to the variable valve timing system. But there's also a subtle sound that has me concerned about potential bearing issues. Marcus couldn't help but glance at Hawthorne, whose face had gone completely white as he listened to the conversation. The symptoms Antonio was describing were remarkably similar to what Marcus had just diagnosed in the Millionaire's car, and the implications were beginning to dawn on him. "Have you checked the oil analysis for metal particles?" Marcus asked, walking a few steps away but still remaining within earshot of his unwelcome customer. "Of course, but everything looks normal on paper. That's what has us so puzzled. The owner insists the car has been properly maintained, low miles, never tracked hard or abused, but you know how it is. Sometimes owners don't tell us everything about how they actually drive their cars. Sometimes they don't even realize what they're doing wrong," Marcus replied, his eyes meeting Hawthorne's directly. "Aggressive driving without proper warm-up periods can cause bearing damage even in low-mileage vehicles. The symptoms can be very subtle at first, but they get progressively worse if ignored." Antonio sighed on the other end of the line. "Exactly what I was thinking. Listen, I know it's a lot to ask, but is there any chance you could consult on this case? We could send you the diagnostic data, maybe set up a video call where you could listen to the engine running. The owner is, how do you say, very demanding, and he's threatening to involve corporate headquarters if we can't solve this quickly." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the request while watching Hawthorne's growing discomfort. "I might have an even better idea, Antonio. I have a similar case here in my shop right now. Same symptoms you're describing. Unusual sound during acceleration, possible timing issues complicated by what sounds like bearing problems. If I can solve this one, the solution should apply to your case as well." "Really? That's incredible timing, my friend. You always were the best diagnostic technician we had, even better than some of our engineers. Even when you left Italy to open your own shop, I knew you'd keep making the impossible possible." Hawthorne was now staring at Marcus with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. The conversation he was overhearing was completely at odds with his assumptions about the humble mechanic standing before him, and his worldview was beginning to crack like ice in the spring sun. "Let me work on this case and document everything for you," Marcus continued, his confidence growing with each word. "Full diagnostic procedure, root cause analysis, repair methodology. It'll be a good case study for your technical training program." "Perfect. And Marcus, thank you. You know we wouldn't call anyone else for something this complex and challenging. Send me your findings when you're done, and we'll make sure you're properly compensated for the consultation work." "Looking forward to it. Give my regards to the team." "Always do. Ciao, my friend." Marcus ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. The parking lot was dead silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bird call from the oak tree that gave the street its name. Hawthorne stood frozen in place, his mouth slightly open, while Jake was now openly grinning at the dramatic turn of events. "That was—" Hawthorne began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with the words and their implications. "That was Antonio Benedetti," Marcus said calmly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that hadn't been there before. "Chief engineer for Lamborghini's North American Technical Division. We worked together for 2 years in Italy before I came back to the States to take over this shop from my mentor." The color continued draining from Hawthorne's face as the reality of his situation became clear. You actually worked for Lamborghini, at their factory." "Not just worked for them," Marcus replied, his voice gaining strength with each revelation. "I was part of the team that developed the diagnostic protocols for the Huracan's engine management system. The procedures that every authorized dealer in North America uses when they can't figure out a problem. I helped write them." Jake could barely contain his laughter at this point. "This just keeps getting better and better." But Marcus wasn't finished dismantling Hawthorne's assumptions. "The local expertise you've been mocking for the past hour? It includes advanced certifications from Lamborghini, Ferrari, McLaren, and Porsche. The blue-collar education you dismiss so casually. It includes a mechanical engineering degree from Oregon State and 2 years of intensive training at some of the most prestigious automotive facilities in Europe. Hawthorne's hands were trembling slightly now as the magnitude of his mistake became fully apparent. The wealthy, entitled customer who had walked into this modest shop an hour ago thinking he was dealing with some simple-minded local mechanic was now face to face with one of the most qualified automotive experts in the country. But this place, it looks so, Hawthorne stammered, gesturing weakly at the modest surroundings. Humble? Marcus supplied with a slight smile. I chose to come back here because this community needed someone who could provide honest, high-quality service without the markup that comes with fancy showrooms and marble floors. I could have stayed in Italy working for Lamborghini, or opened a boutique shop in Beverly Hills, or worked for any luxury dealer in the country. Instead, I came home to serve people who work hard for their money and deserve respect, regardless of what they drive or how much money they have. The small crowd of onlookers had grown larger as word spread through the neighborhood that something significant was happening at Thompson's Auto Repair. Mrs. Patterson had arrived to check on her Honda, and several other customers and curious neighbors had gathered to see what all the commotion was about. Now, Marcus continued, his voice taking on the tone of professional authority that came from decades of experience and expertise, about your car. The symptoms I identified are consistent with a case that Lamborghini's factory engineers are struggling with right now. Would you like me to perform a proper diagnostic, or would you prefer to take your chances elsewhere? Hawthorne looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route from the humiliation he had brought upon himself. His expensive car, which had been a symbol of his superiority just minutes before, now felt like evidence of his ignorance and arrogance. Everyone in the parking lot was looking at him, waiting to see how he would respond to this dramatic reversal of fortune. I don't understand, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. If you're really as qualified as you claim to be, why are you working here? Why aren't you at a dealership or a specialty shop where you could make more money? Marcus smiled genuinely for the first time since Hawthorne had arrived. Because, Mr. Hawthorne, not everything in life is about maximizing profit or status symbols. Sometimes it's about making a real difference in people's lives. Mrs. Patterson over there? She's a retired teacher living on a fixed income. I keep her car running safely for a fraction of what a dealer would charge, and that money she saves goes toward her grandchildren's college fund. He gestured toward another customer in the growing crowd. Mr. Rodriguez works 2 jobs to support his family. When his truck broke down last month, I let him pay for the repairs in installments because I knew losing transportation would cost him one of those jobs. That's not something you'll find at a luxury dealership with overhead costs and profit margins to maintain. Jake stepped forward, unable to resist adding his perspective to the conversation. I've known Marcus since high school. He was the smartest guy in our class, got full scholarships to 3 different engineering schools. But he's also the most decent person I know. He could be making 10 times what he makes here, but he chose to build something meaningful instead of just chasing money. Hawthorne's worldview was crumbling around him like a house of cards in a strong wind. Everything he thought he knew about success, worth, and social hierarchy was being challenged by the reality standing before him. The man he'd been dismissing as a simple mechanic was not only more qualified than him in every relevant way, but was also demonstrating a kind of character and integrity that Hawthorne's privileged upbringing had never taught him to value or understand. So, Marcus said, his voice returning to its professional tone, what would you like to do about your car? For a long moment, Hawthorne just stood there, struggling with a lifetime of assumptions and prejudices that were being turned upside down. The easy path would be to apologize immediately, accept Marcus's help, and learn from this humbling experience. But pride is a powerful force, especially in someone who has never had to acknowledge being fundamentally wrong about something so basic. I I need to think about this, Hawthorne finally said, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the street. Of course, Marcus replied with genuine understanding, but I should warn you, if what I heard is correct, that bearing issue will only get worse with time and continued driving. The longer you wait to address it, the more expensive the repair will become. What sounds like a several $1,000 fix now could easily become a complete engine rebuild, costing $50,000 or more if you continue driving the car hard. Hawthorne's face went even paler at the mention of such enormous repair costs. Several $1,000s, possibly more, depending on how much damage has already occurred internally. The good news is that if we catch it early enough, we might be able to save the engine with a relatively minor repair. The bad news is that every mile you drive aggressively is potentially making the problem worse and more expensive to fix. The millionaire looked at his pristine Lamborghini, then back at Marcus. For the first time since he'd arrived, his arrogance had been completely replaced by vulnerability and uncertainty. The confident, entitled customer who had walked into the shop an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand just how wrong he had been about everything. How long would a complete diagnostic take? He asked quietly. About 2 hours for a thorough analysis. I'd need to connect the car to my diagnostic equipment, perform a detailed inspection of the engine bay, and probably do an oil analysis to check for metal particles. If you're willing to wait, I can start immediately. Hawthorne nodded slowly, but then seemed to remember something that had been bothering him. Your diagnostic equipment. Is it really sophisticated enough for a car like this? Jake laughed out loud. Show him the back room, Marcus. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward the rear of the shop. Would you like to see my equipment before we proceed with any diagnostic work? They walked through the main work area, past the lifts and tool chests that Marcus had accumulated over the years, toward a door marked Authorized Personnel Only. Marcus opened it to reveal a room that looked like it belonged in a high-tech laboratory rather than a neighborhood auto shop. The diagnostic bay contained equipment that most dealerships could only dream of owning. Multiple computer stations loaded with the latest automotive software, oscilloscopes for electrical diagnosis, gas analyzers for emissions testing, and diagnostic interfaces for dozens of different manufacturers from around the world. But the centerpiece of the room was a machine that made Hawthorne's jaw drop, a Lamborghini factory diagnostic computer, identical to the systems used at authorized service centers worldwide. This is the same diagnostic system they use in Sant'Agata Bolognese, Marcus explained casually. Antonio helped me acquire it when I opened the shop. It's updated monthly with the latest diagnostic protocols and technical service bulletins directly from the factory in Italy. Hawthorne stared at the equipment in stunned silence. The room represented an investment of hundreds of thousands of dollars and connections that money alone couldn't buy. It was crystal clear that Marcus Thompson wasn't just some lucky local mechanic who had gotten in over his head. He was a legitimate expert with resources and capabilities that matched or exceeded those of any luxury dealership. I owe you an apology, Hawthorne said finally, his voice barely audible above the hum of the sophisticated equipment. Marcus turned to face him, and for the first time since the confrontation had begun, there was genuine compassion in his expression rather than defensive anger. Mr. Hawthorne, we all make assumptions sometimes based on incomplete information. What matters is what we do when we realize we're wrong. But before Hawthorne could respond with the apology that was clearly building in his mind, the sound of another engine filled the parking lot. Through the windows, they could see a tow truck pulling up with a familiar-looking Lamborghini Huracan on its flatbed, apparently the very car that Antonio had called about from the factory. Well, Marcus said with a slight smile, looking at the second identical Lamborghini, it looks like we're about to have a very educational afternoon. Dikay, the tow truck driver, A heavy-set man named Danny, who had been delivering cars to Marcus for years, climbed down from his cab with a bemused expression on his weathered face. "Marcus, you're not going to believe this," Danny called out as he began the process of unloading the second Lamborghini. But the folks at Lamborghini's corporate office specifically requested that this car be brought directly to you. Something about a consultation on a complex diagnostic case that has their engineers stumped. Hawthorne watched in continued fascination and growing embarrassment as the pearl-white Huracan was carefully lowered from the flatbed. It was nearly identical to his own car, down to the color scheme and wheel configuration. The only visible difference was the manufacturer's license plate still attached to the front bumper, indicating that it was being handled directly by the factory rather than through a dealer network. Two identical cars with the same mysterious problem, Jake observed with obvious amusement. What are the odds of that happening? In my experience, problems like this usually indicate either a design flaw or a bad batch of components from a supplier, Marcus replied, accepting the paperwork from Danny and reviewing the technical notes that had been included with the delivery. If we can solve one case definitively, we'll likely have the solution for both. As the tow truck drove away, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from Antonio. "Car should be arriving any moment. Owner is flying in from Los Angeles tomorrow morning. Very high-profile client. Needs to be absolutely perfect. You're our only hope for a quick resolution." Marcus showed the message to Hawthorne, whose face went through several different expressions as the full implications continued to sink in. Not only was Marcus Thompson qualified to work on Lamborghinis, he was apparently the go-to expert when even the factory engineers couldn't solve a problem that had them stumped. "Mr. Hawthorne," Marcus said gently, "I'd like to suggest something that might benefit both of us. Since we have two identical cars with similar symptoms, would you be willing to let me diagnose them together? It would give us a much better understanding of the underlying problem, and you'd benefit from all the research and analysis that Lamborghini's factory engineers have already done." Hawthorne nodded mutely, still processing the morning's revelations and trying to come to terms with how completely wrong he had been about everything. His world had been turned completely upside down, and he was beginning to understand that his assumptions about success and competence had been far more limited and prejudiced than he'd ever realized. Marcus pulled both Lamborghinis into the shop's main bay, positioning them side by side under the bright LED work lights that illuminated every detail of their sleek Italian engineering. The contrast was striking. Two identical machines representing the pinnacle of automotive design and performance, both suffering from the same mysterious ailment that had the best minds in the industry scratching their heads. "Jake, would you mind helping me with the initial inspection?" Marcus asked. "I could use an extra set of experienced eyes for something this complex." "Absolutely," Jake replied, pulling on a pair of work gloves. Despite his successful career in software engineering, he'd maintained his mechanical skills over the years and often helped Marcus with particularly challenging projects that required multiple perspectives. As Marcus began connecting diagnostic equipment to the first Lamborghini, the factory car that had just been delivered, Hawthorne stood awkwardly to the side, unsure of his role in the proceedings. He'd gone from being a demanding customer to an unwilling observer of his own humiliation in the span of just a few hours. "Mr. Hawthorne," Marcus said without looking up from his work, "if you'd like to learn something about your car and what might be wrong with it, you're welcome to observe closely. This diagnostic process might help you understand what's really happening under the hood and why proper expertise matters." It was an olive branch, offered generously despite the morning's insults and condescension. Hawthorne stepped closer, his expensive shoes clicking on the concrete floor as he tried to process this unexpected display of grace and professionalism from someone he had treated so poorly. Marcus began his inspection methodically, starting with a thorough visual examination of the engine bay. His hands moved with the practiced confidence of someone who had diagnosed thousands of problems over the years. checking connections, inspecting hoses, and looking for any signs of obvious issues that might provide clues to the underlying problem. As he worked, he explained each step in detail, his voice taking on the patient tone of a master craftsman teaching an apprentice, rather than a defensive mechanic trying to justify his expertise. The Huracan's engine is truly a masterpiece of modern engineering, Marcus began, his hands working efficiently while he spoke. But it's also incredibly complex, with dozens of interconnected systems that all have to work together perfectly. When something goes wrong, it can be extremely challenging to isolate the root cause because so many systems are interconnected and interdependent. He connected a digital oscilloscope to various sensors throughout the engine bay, watching carefully as patterns appeared on the screen that would have been meaningless to most people, but told Marcus exactly what he needed to know about the engine's internal condition. These sensors monitor everything from airflow to exhaust gas composition, and when they start showing irregular patterns, they tell us a story about what's happening inside the engine that we can't see directly. Hawthorne found himself genuinely interested despite his embarrassment and wounded pride. What kind of story are they telling you? Well, for example, this oxygen sensor reading suggests that cylinder number 7 is running slightly lean compared to the others. That could indicate a fuel delivery problem, an air leak somewhere in the intake system, or mechanical issues specific to that cylinder. Marcus moved to his computer station and pulled up the sophisticated diagnostic software that interfaced with the Lamborghini's onboard systems. The screen filled with data streams, graphs, and diagnostic codes that would have been completely meaningless to most people, but provided Marcus with a detailed picture of exactly what was happening inside the engine. "Interesting," he murmured, studying the patterns and data with the focused intensity of a detective examining evidence. "Jake, take a look at this fuel pressure reading." Jake leaned over Marcus's shoulder, examining the data displays with the analytical skills he'd developed in his technology career. "That fluctuation at higher RPMs, that's definitely not normal, is it?" "No, it's not. And when you combine it with the timing irregularities we're seeing here, it suggests a problem with either the high-pressure fuel pump or possibly the fuel rail pressure sensor." Hawthorne listened to this technical discussion with growing respect and understanding. The easy familiarity with which Marcus and Jake analyzed the complex data made it absolutely clear that this wasn't just theoretical knowledge gained from reading manuals. It was deep, practical expertise gained through years of hands-on experience with the most sophisticated automotive systems in the world. "But that still doesn't explain the bearing noise I heard," Marcus continued, frowning slightly at the screen. "Let me check the oil analysis from the factory car first." He pulled out a small vial of oil that had been included with the factory paperwork and placed a single drop on a specialized testing device that could detect microscopic metal particles. Within moments, results appeared on the screen showing the presence of metal contamination that shouldn't have been there in a properly functioning engine. "There it is," Marcus said grimly. "Bearing wear in cylinder 7, just as I suspected from the sound. The question now is whether it's a cause or an effect of the other problems we're seeing." He moved to Hawthorne's car and repeated the oil analysis procedure. The results were nearly identical, confirming that both vehicles were indeed suffering from the same combination of issues. "So what does all of this mean for my car?" Hawthorne asked, his voice subdued by the realization of how serious the problem might be. Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying the data from both cars and considering the implications. "It means we're dealing with a systemic problem rather than a random failure. The fuel pressure irregularities are causing cylinder 7 to run lean, which leads to overheating and subsequent bearing damage. If we can fix the fuel delivery issue, we can prevent further damage, but the existing bearing wear will need to be addressed separately." "How serious is the damage?" "For the factory car, we caught it relatively early. The bearing damage appears to be minimal, and we can probably repair it without requiring a complete engine rebuild. For your car, Marcus hesitated, then decided that complete honesty was the only ethical approach. You've been driving with this problem for longer. The damage is more extensive. Hawthorne's face went pale again as the financial implications began to sink in. How much more extensive? I'll need to do a more detailed inspection to be absolutely certain, but based on the metal content in your oil and the severity of the sounds I heard, I'd estimate you have maybe 50 to 100 miles of hard driving before you risk complete catastrophic engine failure. The silence that followed was profound and heavy. Hawthorne's $300,000 status symbol had suddenly become a potential financial disaster, and the man he'd been insulting and dismissing all morning was apparently the only person qualified to save him from it. Can you actually fix it?" Hawthorne asked quietly, his voice filled with a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Marcus looked at him for a long moment, then at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. Despite everything that had happened, despite all the insults and condescension, Marcus was still committed to providing the best possible service to anyone who needed his help. "I can fix it. Both cars, actually. But I need to be completely honest with you about what's involved. It's going to be expensive, and it's going to take considerable time. The fuel rail assembly will need to be completely replaced. The pressure sensor will need to be recalibrated, and the engine will need to be partially disassembled to address the bearing damage properly." "How expensive are we talking about?" Marcus considered the question carefully, knowing that his answer would determine whether Hawthorne would trust him with the repair or seek help elsewhere. "For your car, given the extent of the damage, probably $15,000 to $20,000. For the factory car, maybe half that since we caught the problem earlier." Hawthorne sat down heavily in one of the waiting area chairs, his head in his hands as the financial reality of the situation hit him. $20,000. He repeated numbly. "Mr. Hawthorne," Marcus said gently, approaching him with genuine concern, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. How do you typically drive this car?" Hawthorne looked up, confusion replacing despair on his face. "What do you mean? Do you warm it up before driving aggressively? Do you let it idle for a few minutes when you first start it before pushing it hard? Or do you typically start it up and immediately accelerate hard onto the freeway?" The guilty expression that crossed Hawthorne's face provided the answer before he even spoke. I usually just start it and go. Time is money, you know. I didn't think a car this expensive would need a warm-up period like some old vehicle." Marcus nodded understandingly, without a trace of judgment in his expression. "That's actually a very common misconception with high-performance engines. The tighter tolerances and advanced metallurgy actually make them more sensitive to temperature variations, not less. When you start a cold engine and immediately put it under heavy load, the thermal expansion happens unevenly, which can cause exactly the kind of damage we're seeing here. So this is entirely my fault? It's a contributing factor, Marcus admitted honestly, but the underlying fuel system problem would have occurred regardless of your driving habits. Your approach to warming up just accelerated the timeline and made the damage more severe. Jake, who had been listening to the conversation while continuing to analyze the diagnostic data, suddenly looked up with an expression of surprise and realization. "Marcus, you need to see this right now." Marcus joined him at the computer station, and his eyebrows shot up as he read the information displayed on the screen. "Well, that's very interesting indeed." "What?" Hawthorne asked, approaching the computer with obvious trepidation about what new problem might have been discovered. "It looks like both of these cars were built during the exact same production week," Marcus explained, pointing to the serial number information displayed on the screen. "The serial numbers are only 17 units apart. That strongly suggests we're looking at a bad batch of fuel rail assemblies rather than random individual failures." He picked up his phone and immediately dialed Antonio's number. The call was answered before the first ring finished. "Antonio, it's Marcus. I've got both cars here now. And I think we're looking at a batch quality issue with the fuel rail assemblies. The serial numbers indicate both cars were built within just a few days of each other. Madonna mia! Antonio's voice came through the speaker with obvious concern. How many units are we potentially talking about? Based on the serial number spread and typical production runs, maybe 50 to 100 cars worldwide. You're going to want to issue a technical service bulletin immediately and possibly initiate a recall. There was a pause on the other end of the line as Antonio processed the implications. Marcus, this is potentially a very serious situation. If there are dozens of cars out there with this problem and owners don't know to look for the early warning symptoms, exactly what I was thinking. Catastrophic engine failures, potential safety issues if failures occur at high speed, and major warranty claims. The sooner you can identify the affected units and notify owners, the better it will be for everyone involved. Can you send me everything you've found so far? Complete documentation, diagnostic data, repair procedures, everything? Absolutely. I'll have a comprehensive report ready within the hour. And Marcus, this discovery of yours, it's going to save the company millions of dollars in potential damage claims and liability issues. The board is definitely going to want to discuss appropriate compensation for this level of consultation work. Hawthorne had been listening to this conversation with growing amazement. Not only was Marcus solving his immediate problem, but he had potentially discovered a factory defect that could affect dozens of other vehicles and prevent catastrophic failures for unsuspecting owners around the world. After Marcus ended the call, Hawthorne stood quietly for a long moment, trying to process everything he'd witnessed and learned. His expensive car, which he'd thought made him superior to the people around him, had turned out to have a serious manufacturing defect. The humble mechanic he'd been insulting and looking down on had not only diagnosed the problem correctly, but had potentially saved Lamborghini from a public relations disaster and protected dozens of other owners from experiencing catastrophic and dangerous failures. "Mr. Thompson," Hawthorne said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you much more than just an apology. I owe you my gratitude, my respect, and probably an acknowledgement that you've taught me something important about making assumptions about people." Marcus looked at him with genuine surprise. "Mr. Hawthorne, all I did was my job to the best of my ability." "No." Hawthorne shook his head firmly, his voice growing stronger. "You did much more than that. You showed me what real expertise looks like, what real character and professionalism look like. I came in here this morning thinking my money and status made me better than you, and you've shown me that I don't know the first thing about what really matters in life." He gestured around the shop, taking in the sophisticated equipment, the organized workspace, and the evidence of years of dedicated craftsmanship. "This place isn't humble because you lack ambition or ability. It's humble because you have the confidence and integrity to define success on your own terms, to build something meaningful rather than just profitable." Jake was grinning broadly, proud of his friend's vindication, and impressed by Hawthorne's apparent capacity for growth and self-reflection. "Mr. Hawthorne," Marcus said quietly, "I appreciate your words more than you know, but I hope you understand that this revelation works both ways. You made assumptions about me based on superficial appearances, but I made assumptions about you too. I assumed that because you were wealthy and initially condescending, you were incapable of growth or genuine reflection. Today has shown me that people can surprise you if you give them the opportunity." Hawthorne nodded gratefully. "What you've given me today is more valuable than any car repair, no matter how expensive or complex. You've given me a mirror to see myself clearly, probably for the first time in my adult life." "So, what will you do with that reflection?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about how this experience might change the wealthy man's perspective and behavior. Hawthorne was quiet for a moment, considering the question with obvious seriousness. "I honestly don't know yet, but I know I can't go back to thinking and behaving the way I did this morning. The way I treated you, The assumptions I made, that's not who I want to be anymore. Marcus walked over to the computer station and printed out a detailed repair estimate for Hawthorne's car, including a complete breakdown of parts, labor, and expected timeline. Before we talk about major life changes, we should probably discuss getting your car fixed properly. As I mentioned, the repair cost will be significant, but given that this appears to be a manufacturing defect, Lamborghini should cover most or all of the cost under their warranty program. What if they don't cover it for some reason? Hawthorne asked. Then we'll fix it anyway, Marcus replied without hesitation. A car this beautiful and sophisticated deserves to be properly maintained and repaired, regardless of who ultimately pays for the work. Hawthorne looked at the repair estimate, then back at Marcus with an expression of genuine puzzlement. You know, the cost doesn't really matter to me personally. I can afford it either way without any financial hardship. But the principle does matter. The fact that you would stand behind the quality of your work and commit to proper repairs regardless of payment, that's something I've never encountered in any business relationship. It's not really about business, Marcus replied simply. It's about doing the right thing and taking pride in your work. As the afternoon wore on, the three men continued working together to complete the diagnostic documentation and prepare both cars for the complex repairs that would be needed. The factory Lamborghini would be addressed first, since its damage was less severe and could serve as a test case for the repair procedures. Then Marcus would tackle the more extensive and challenging repairs needed for Hawthorne's vehicle. But as they worked side by side, Hawthorne found himself asking deeper questions, not just about automotive technology and repair procedures, but about life choices, about what constituted real success and meaning, about the difference between having wealth and creating genuine value in the world. Marcus, he said during a quiet moment while they were reviewing diagnostic data, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever regret not taking what most people would consider the easier path, the high-paying consulting jobs, the luxury dealership positions, the opportunities to maximize your income potential? Marcus considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer might influence how Hawthorne thought about his own life choices going forward. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd made different choices, taken different opportunities. But regret? No, I don't think so. Every morning when I come to work, I know that what I'm doing here matters in a real and tangible way. Mrs. Patterson can get to her doctor's appointments safely because I keep her car running properly. Mr. Rodriguez can get to both of his jobs and support his family because I provide reliable service at prices he can afford. That has a kind of value that goes far beyond money. But you could help people and make significantly more money at the same time, Hawthorne pointed out thoughtfully. You could take that Lamborghini consulting contract and donate the extra income to charity, or use it to provide free services to people who need them. It was a perceptive observation, and Marcus nodded appreciatively. You're absolutely right, and I'm actually seriously considering the consulting offer for exactly that reason. But there's something to be said for staying connected to your community on a daily basis, for being the person people can rely on every day rather than the expert they call for special occasions. Jake looked up from the documentation work he'd been doing on his laptop. Marcus has always been about the long game rather than quick wins. He's building something that will outlast any individual success or failure. What do you mean by that? Hawthorne asked, genuinely curious. Marcus gestured toward a corner of the shop where a young man in coveralls was carefully organizing tools and cleaning equipment. That's Tommy Rodriguez, Mr. Rodriguez's son. He's been working here part-time after school for the past 2 years, learning the trade and developing real skills. Next year, he's starting at the community college in their automotive technology program, and when he graduates, he'll have a job waiting here if he wants it. You're training your replacement? Hawthorne asked, confused by the concept. I'm training my successor, Marcus corrected gently. Someone who understands that this business is about more than profit margins and efficiency ratings. Tommy's growing up in this community, learning to serve his neighbors with the same pride and dedication that his father shows in his work. The implications of Marcus's approach were beginning to dawn on Hawthorne. This wasn't just a business in the traditional sense, it was a legacy, a commitment to community continuity that went far beyond any individual's career or financial success. "How many young people have you mentored over the years?" Hawthorne asked. "Tommy's the fifth. The others have gone on to start their own shops, work for dealerships, or move into automotive engineering careers. But they all learned the same fundamental lesson. Technical skill without character and integrity is just expensive labor." As the day drew to a close, the diagnostic work was complete, and both Lamborghinis had been positioned and prepared for the repair work that would begin the following morning. Marcus had already contacted Lamborghini's parts department and arranged for expedited delivery of all necessary components, with Antonio's direct intervention ensuring that everything would arrive on schedule. Hawthorne stood in the parking lot next to his car, keys in hand, but seemingly reluctant to leave. The day had been transformative in ways he was still trying to understand and process, and the prospect of returning to his normal routine felt somehow inadequate and unsatisfying. "Mr. Thompson," he said finally, "I have a confession to make, and I think it's important for you to hear it." Marcus and Jake looked at him expectantly, curious about what other revelations this remarkable day might bring. "I didn't just stumble into your shop by accident today. I'd actually been driving around for several weeks, ignoring that sound in my car because I was afraid of what it might cost to fix and how long I might be without my car. When I finally decided to do something about it, I specifically chose your shop because I thought it would be cheaper than going to an authorized dealership." He paused, clearly embarrassed by what he was about to admit. "I came here this morning planning to intimidate you into giving me a significant discount, to use my wealth and social status to get a better deal than I would have received elsewhere. The irony is that you're probably the most expensive and qualified mechanic in the entire city when you factor in your level of expertise, but you charge less than you're worth because you care more about serving people than maximizing your income." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then smiled with genuine warmth. "Mr. Hawthorne, we all make mistakes and misjudgments. What matters is what we learn from them and how we choose to behave going forward. I want to make this right," Hawthorne said urgently, "not just with an apology, but with something more meaningful and substantial. You've shown me what it looks like to use your talents and resources to serve others rather than just yourself. I want to find a way to do the same thing with my own capabilities and resources." "What did you have in mind?" Marcus asked, intrigued by the direction the conversation was taking. Hawthorne was quiet for a moment, an idea clearly forming in his mind as he spoke. "What if we could create some kind of program to help people like Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Rodriguez, people who need reliable transportation to maintain their employment and support their families, but can't afford major repairs when problems arise? What if there was a way to subsidize their costs without making it feel like charity or undermining their dignity?" Marcus's eyebrows raised with genuine interest. "That's an intriguing idea. How would you envision something like that working?" "Hawthorne Properties owns commercial real estate throughout this city and the surrounding area. We could establish an automotive assistance fund, maybe partner with shops like yours to provide low-cost or free repairs for people who meet certain income criteria. The funding would come from my company's resources, but the actual work would be done by mechanics who understand and serve their communities." Jake was grinning now, obviously excited by the potential of such a program. "That's actually a brilliant idea, with real potential for meaningful impact." "It would have to be structured very carefully," Marcus said thoughtfully. "People have pride and self-respect, and they won't accept what feels like handouts or charity. But if it's structured as a legitimate community program, something people can apply for and qualify for based on clear criteria." "Exactly," Hawthorne said with growing excitement. And it wouldn't just be about free repairs. It could include automotive education programs, job training opportunities for young people like Tommy, maybe even small business loans for mechanics who want to start their own community-focused shops. The three men stood in the parking lot as the sun began to set over Portland, the city lights starting to twinkle in the distance like promises of possibility. What had begun as a simple car repair had evolved into something much larger, a vision for community service and social impact that could potentially transform hundreds of lives. "You know," Marcus said finally, "if you're serious about this idea and willing to put real resources behind it, I might be more interested in that Lamborghini consulting contract than I initially thought. The extra income could fund my participation in your program and allow me to expand the services I can offer to the community." Hawthorne's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Are you saying you'd consider partnering with me on something like this?" "I'm saying that today has taught me something important too," Marcus replied. "Sometimes the best way to serve your immediate community is to think bigger and more strategically. If we can create a model that works here in Portland, maybe it could work in other cities and communities as well." As Hawthorne finally drove his Lamborghini slowly out of the parking lot, very carefully, mindful of Marcus's warnings about the bearing damage, he felt as if he was leaving as a completely different person than the one who had arrived that morning. The car that had once represented his superiority over others now felt like a reminder of how much he still had to learn about what really mattered in life and how to measure true success. But he was no longer the arrogant, entitled millionaire who had walked into Thompson's Auto Repair looking for a quick fix and a discounted price. He was someone who had been given the invaluable gift of perspective and self-awareness, and he was determined not to waste the opportunity for growth and positive change that had been placed before him. Marcus watched the expensive car disappear into the evening traffic, then turned back toward his shop where Jake was helping to secure the equipment and prepare for the next day's work. The foundation they had laid that afternoon felt solid and full of potential, but he knew that turning vision into reality would require sustained effort, careful planning, and unwavering commitment to the values that had brought them together. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of complex repairs on two sophisticated vehicles, but it would also mark the start of something much more significant, a partnership between two very different men who had discovered that their diverse backgrounds and capabilities could be combined to create something neither could achieve alone. If this incredible story of transformation, humility, and partnership has inspired you to look for opportunities to bridge differences and serve others in your own community, then the real message has been received. Sometimes the most meaningful changes begin with the simple willingness to see past our assumptions about others and recognize that everyone has something valuable to offer. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things to make their communities stronger and better for everyone.